grateful to the Foundation of Writers and Journalism for having me here and to be able to present you a very local, very small-scale project that is happening right in the center of Europe in Berlin. Berlin is, as many of you know, in the middle of Europe. It sits right between the west and the east, the north and the south, and it has also become, over the last decades, one of the most multi- or interreligious cities in the world. It has always been a city that had a divided history between secular and Christian denominations, and it has increasingly become, over centuries, a place where, at least over certain periods of time, European Judaism has had one of its centers of learning and religious practice. Over the last decades, it has also become increasingly a center of Muslim European life, especially the Turkish and the Middle Eastern communities find their homes there. And the city has been reacting on various levels, institutionally, educationally, and religiously to this changing religious and increasingly pluralistic landscape in one of Europe's major capitals. What you're seeing here is one of the first maps of Berlin from the 12th century, where Berlin really more or less existed as a two-part city by the names of Berlin and Cologne. You see here the lower part of the city has already one of the oldest churches in its center by the name of St. Petri. So the places that I'm going to referate about has really been existing on the European map since the 12th century. I'm talking mainly about a Christian community by the name St. Peter and St. Mary in the center of Berlin that became, throughout the centuries, one of the Protestant Christian centers of the religious life in Berlin, and during the time of the German segregation, happened to become part of the so-called dead zone in the middle of the city where there were no civil life, no building possible. So when Martin Luther King came to Berlin in the 60s, he gave a speech in the second of the churches by the name of St. Mary, calling upon the people of the world, for the unification of Europe, the end of the Cold War, and for the establishment of an interreligious dialogue in the heart of Europe. It should take a couple of more decades until any of this would even be possible to think about. But after the German unification in 1989, the city started with archaeological works in the former dead zone, and they found the remains of the former St. Petri Church. This city then initiated a conversation of how they could reshape a place that has been marked by interstate or divided state violence, and how they could rededicate and revive the center of Berlin and make it into more than just another commercializing area. What you see here are the remains of the early church, and the first impulse of the city was to turn it into yet another church in the center of Berlin. Then they broadened the conversation and invited Jewish and Muslim conversational partners into the dialogue, and they established the idea of building in the center of Berlin a place that would be open to the three great monotheistic religions on equal terms. In 2009, the city of Berlin asked architects worldwide to send in proposals for a building that would reflect religious pluralism, separate but tolerating each other's. And in 2019, we're hoping to start our building project. What you see here is what is existing already in the center of Berlin. It is called the House of One, and it consists by now of a pavilion, which is open to all sides. It's enlightened during the night, so it's a pretty beautiful site. And they started with very localized little projects to attract the attention of diverse religious, secular, and religious communities. It's a pavilion surrounded by garden projects that mostly attract younger generations. But in the center of Berlin, it also attracts the attention of millions of tourists, of the local, mostly secularized population, and it becomes a place for public religious discourse in a city that has long not been used to any of these things happening. What you see here is in the background, Berlin-Alexanderplatz, the former center of East Berlin, that has become, due to the House of One, a center where religious denominations come together, demonstrate together, commemorate together, meditate together, if weather allows, and celebrate together. So one of the major tasks of the House of One has been formulated by its founder as Berlin, historical background of the friendship between Moses Mendelssohn and Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, cradle of the European emancipation, center to the beautiful reunification of divided Germany. Berlin will become the place in which religious pluralism will be lived peacefully and openly, and differences will be honored. Coming back to the first presentation we heard today, right after the keynote, these are two crucial principles that guide the work of the House of One. It is a pluralistic place, and it is a place that does not cover up any of the inherent differences between the religious denominations, but also among the religious denominations that are involved in the project. Due to the history, the religious history of Berlin, the Protestant Church has a major role in the project, but also the Catholic Church and the Russian Orthodox Church is actively involved. It is true that it is mostly liberal Judaism, the Abraham Geiger Rabbinical School, and the Jewish community of Berlin that is involved with the ongoing educational projects of the House of One, but equally, the Orthodox community of Berlin sends people to speak, and sends people also to learn. We are also collaborating with a wide variety of Muslim organizations and mosques in the city, and we're constantly working on expanding the conversation and inviting in more and different voices. This has brought us to many interesting questions, also when it comes to the future architecture of the sacred places, about which I'll speak as I continue my presentation. So what you see here is they invite students, high school students mostly, to come and learn at the place of the House of One, as well as visiting them in their own school classes, and teach them about religions that they don't know yet enough about. You also probably should know that Germany has a school system that gives a lot of space to religious education in the sense of the American Divinity School. It teaches about religion, but it doesn't teach specific religions in most parts of Germany. So what is happening here is that people get sensitized to different values, different histories, different stories and myths that make people decide or adhere to specific behavioral guidances that they decide on every single day. It is not only teaching, it is also a much more informal education, shared singing, gardening that I already mentioned, but more important than the work with the student itself is the work with the teachers. The House of One has developed a curriculum for high school teachers and more informal education at churches, mosques, and synagogues to speak to students about different religions, to invite them in, and to prevent escalating conflicts in Berlin high schools. I don't know if to what an extent this has been in the press, but the last year we had to register an increasing number of anti-Semitic attacks on Jewish students in Berlin, and the city has recognized these developments with increasing worries. And last but not least, the House of One also organized public lectures in order to educate the broader Berlin society about the project that is happening right in the middle of the city. The second part of the vision was really the building of a building that would symbolize the vision of the House of One in the middle of Berlin. What you see here is the building, the highest point is called the Tower of Encounter. You see here that it's right in the center of the building. What you don't see from the outside is that the inside is very much conceptualized as a four-part building. The parts B, C, and D are respectively the church, the synagogue, and the mosque, all of them using equal materials, having similar lights, and praying on an equal ground level, whereas in the middle, you see the Hall of Encounter, a circle that invites people to sit together, share ideas, and sometimes just sit there in silence. This idea doesn't look very radical due to the very solemn architecture, but it is actually one of the first buildings ever erected with the aim in mind to have a building in which three major religions come together, pray separately, but have to meet each other on their way into their sacred spaces. The last and maybe most important part of the work of the House of One is based on the idea of the Hall of Encounter, part of which is also a coffee shop and a library, to create shared projects, to create a space in the middle of Berlin where people who would rather normally not talk to each other engage with each other on a regular basis. What you see here is a shared Muslim and Jewish project in which Muslim neighbors helped Jews living in Berlin to re-erect Jewish gravestones that have been demolished last year. In this picture, you see an impressive outcome of a several-day-long workshop between Christian and Muslim Berlin high school students learning about each other and finding shared interests for their future work in politics and religious education. We have a number of women groups, mostly Christian and Muslim, who meet regularly, discuss their lives, talk to each other about life in Berlin and their different experiences, which is sometimes a quite humiliating and eye-opening experience for especially the Christian participants of the conversations. And last but not least, the vision of the House of One in Berlin has attracted global attention. We are very, very honored to have partners by now in Georgia and also in Central Africa. What you see here is the House of Peace in Bangui that has been established based on the model of the House of One for Christian and Muslim neighbors of the same space. They have only two, they have not three sections. But what you see here is the German delegation in the middle, surrounded by their African friends and colleagues, trying to make the vision based in Berlin into a model that could promote religious education and daily encounters on a more global level. I've been very honored to bring this to your attention. And I'm also very aware that this project is still in its very beginning. What I found very moving personally is, as someone who doesn't live in Berlin anymore for the last 3 years, I have not been part of the developments of the last 3 years in Germany that we call usually like the beginning of the refugee change. I've been very honored to be here in New York City, watching Europeans doing something that they're not used to do, and what you probably could call prevent conflicts before they're happening. Berlin, in the heart of Europe, is a city that is more, I think, than any other European city right now undergoing radical changes when it comes to its religious landscape. And the city and the church have done whatever they could to actively promote religious dialogues in its middle and with quite a lot of fundraising globally to help to establish a place in its very center for education that does not function top-down, but is very much a bottom-up project. Thank you.